Hello to all of you out here in the audience. I'd like to welcome you to our Hoard's Dairyman monthly webinar. My name is Abby Bauer, and I'm an editor for Hoard's Dairyman magazine. I will be serving as the host for today's show, which will focus on producing high-quality milk. In today's global milk markets, harvesting high-quality milk has never been more important. In this presentation, milk quality trends and goals will be discussed, along with practical management changes that could be emphasized to help reach those goals. If you're listening to the presentation live, you have access to a PDF copy of the slides. You can find that down in the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. Just click on that link and a PDF will pop up of the slides, and you can print that off or save it on your computer if you'd like to have that for future reference. Also, if you have any questions that come to mind while you're listening to the presentation, please type those into the questions section of the control panel, and we will answer those following the presentation. I would like to recognize our sponsor for this webinar, and that is Boehringer Ingelheim, and we really appreciate their support of this webinar production. Today, we'd like to welcome Dr. Pam Ruegg as our webinar presenter. Dr. Ruegg holds the David J. Ellis Chair in Antimicrobial Resistance and Large Animal Clinical Sciences position at Michigan State University's College of Veterinary Medicine. Before taking this role, she previously spent 20 years as a professor and extension specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research and outreach programs are focused on management practices that improve milk quality and sustainability of dairy farms worldwide. Personally, I always really enjoy Dr. Ruegg's presentations, and I'm so glad that she was able to join us for our webinar scheduled this year, and we're really glad to have her as our September speaker. So Dr. Ruegg, welcome to the webinar, and I look forward to hearing your presentation, which is titled Gaining a Competitive Advantage in Milk Quality.
Hey, Abby, thank you so much. It's really good to be here. Most people know I'm not a huge fan of webinars because it's so weird to just stand in your office and talk to your screen with absolutely no audience feedback. And as a veteran of many face-to-face presentations, I always learn a huge amount, often from my audience. But I do value doing webinars because we can reach so many people across such a wide geographic area. So I do like to do them for that purpose, but it's really not quite as fulfilling as doing them in person somewhere. This topic today, I think, is a topic that over the years has really become critical to our industry in producing high quality milk. And what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is how things have changed and how we need to respond to that. Now, I hate to tell people this, but because it shows how old I am, but I started in veterinary practice in Kiel, Wisconsin in 1984. And that's like saying that I lived on Mars relative to how our industry is going, because our entire industry has restructured within the time of my career. And one of the most important things that has happened is that where we sell our milk and the requirements for selling our milk have changed. Now, this graph I'm showing right here shows the commercial disappearance of milk in the United States between 1995 and 2021. There's a couple things I want to point out here. Probably one of the most important things I want to point out is basically for my entire career, we have sold more and more milk every year. And that's a very different story than what you hear when people talk about the reduction in the amount of fluid milk that's sold. But one of the big stories, I think, in our industry is the change in what our product, milk, is used for and where it's going. So if you take a look at this graph, in 1995, we produced about 155 million pounds of milk per year, and 97% of that was consumed domestically. So we were only exporting about 3% of our milk. If you look fast forward to 2021, using the 2022 data, You can see we're now producing about and selling about 230 million pounds of milk. But the disposition of what we're selling is very different. 22% of that was exported in 2021. And we've had a little downtick in some of the export, but export market is a very, very important market for our industry. And what that has changed is the emphasis that we have to be able to compete globally. So it has changed the requirements for what we're producing in order to allow us to compete with big exporters like, for example, New Zealand. And those changes have had a dramatic impact on the type of milk that the processors want to buy. Another thing that's happened is where we're producing milk has changed a bit. Now, this graph shows demographic trends going all the way back to 1970 up to 2021. And one really positive thing to recognize is we produced 194% more milk. Not just produced, we sold 194% more milk in 2022 versus 1970. We have a growing industry. The product we produce, these milk proteins, these milk nutrients, are highly valued. But where it's being produced and where it's going has changed. Now, this graph, I've just taken the total milk production of the top 10 dairy states in 2021 and as compared to everyone else. So these top 10 dairy states are shown down here. And then everybody else, all the other 50 states, are shown in the brown bar at the top. And what you can see is a relative contribution of each state over time. So let's start with just the bottom one. Here's California. Down on the bottom, you can see back in 1970, it had a relatively small bar. California was much bigger, New York was much bigger, but over time, about the time I moved to California in the late 80s, you can see the trajectory and the proportion of sales went up. And then it stabilized out here in about 2008, 2009. So here's the top 10 dairy states. We've got California, we've got Wisconsin, you've got Idaho, New York, Texas, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, New Mexico, Washington, and I've got in here Iowa just for fun. It's not a top 10 dairy state. And then you got all other states. And what you can see is a 10-year change in the share of the US production. And those coded in green, Michigan, Texas, Idaho, and Wisconsin, have all gained market share in the last 10 years. Those in yellow have stayed flat, Washington, Minnesota, and New York. And then several states in the last 10 years have lost a little, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and California. And what you'll see is where our milk production is shifting to relative to what the market wants. And there's some really interesting demographics that that you can see in the next slide here that kind of show some of the trends. And as we're talking about our topic today, milk quality, why it matters. This is the DHIA somatic cell count data for 2000 to 2021, looking at those same top 10 states. Only now I've taken and divided them by the 4 states that gained market share in that 10-year period. That's Wisconsin, Idaho, Texas, and Michigan. And the 3 states that lost market share, California, Pennsylvania, and New Mexico. And then this black dotted line, that's the national, the US average. And if you take a look at these states that have gained market share, you'll see in general, they've had a steeper decline overall in their somatic cell count than the US. And if you look at it in 2021, the average 2021 somatic cell count of the 4 states that gained market share was 163,000. we look at that now in the mirror of 2023 and think, oh, 163,000, that's pretty good. But I've been around long enough where I remember that for, 10 years, we were over 300,000 in most of our states. And then we had this very dramatic decline, which was accelerated by the need to compete in the export market. If you look at the 3 states that lost market shares, we didn't see the same trends, nor in the overall US for the most part. What you'll see is the average 2021 somatic cell count for the 3 states that lost market share was 185,000. Still good. We're producing high quality milk around the US, but it's not as good as the states that are gaining market share where the dairy industry is growing. And, I would propose that's in response to competitive pressure. The processors who are competing with at least part of our product, it's not gallons of milk that are going into these export markets, it's skim milk powder, whey, lactose, ingredients. They want higher quality milk. And so the states that are gaining are tending to be producing milk that is in demand. I bring that as background because I think it's important for us to understand the importance of milk quality and to produce our product that is highly competitive so our individual farms can be highly profitable. So I'm going to talk a little bit about mastitis in that context of where the market's at, where it's going, and some things we can do on a practical basis to make sure that our dairies remain profitable and competitive. So let's start off by talking a little bit, why does mastitis matter at all? Well, mastitis, I just want to start with a definition so we're all on the same page. Mastitis is a very, very simple disease. It's simply a bacterial infection of the udder. We define it and detect it based on intramammary infection. In other words, the immune response to that bacterial infection. 99% of the time, mastitis occurs when bacterial exposure at the teat end exceeds the immune defenses of the cow. So we get bacteria that get into the teat. That immune response within the mammary gland causes inflammation that we call mastitis. And when we have a relatively small immune response, we have normal appearing milk, but we have a migration of the white blood cells into the milk. So the milk appears normal. It has too many white blood cells in the mammary gland. Those white blood cells in the udder are called somatic cells. That's what we call subclinical mastitis. When we have a large immune response, in other words, the cow's immune system has a bigger inflammatory response. That inflammatory response is larger. It prevents proper construction of the milk and may cause some local changes. So now we have abnormal appearing milk, and we have potentially a swollen quarter, red quarter, or even in those rare instances, sick cows. That is what we call clinical mastitis. So we've got subclinical mastitis, meaning a smaller inflammatory response to infection and a larger immune response, where we can see that immune response occurring, where we call it clinical mastitis. But essentially, it's a bacterial infection of the udder that occurs when bacteria get through the teat end. That is, most of the time, this disease that we call mastitis. Mastitis is an outrageously important disease of dairy cattle. It is by far the most frequent disease of dairy cattle. This is data that we collected from 37 large Wisconsin dairy herds. We had about 50,000 cows in this data set. We had about 20,000 first cases of clinical mastitis, but we also were able to enumerate all the other diseases. You'll see clinical mastitis occurred in almost 30% of the cows. The next most frequent health event was lameness at about 12%, and then metritis was about 10%, ketosis 8%, many more diseases, far less frequent. So mastitis is a very significant disease on most farms. In fact, if we go to most farms today and just took milk samples and measured the somatic cells, about 15 to 35% of the cows would have cell count values that are high enough that it indicates the cow has subclinical mastitis. And on most dairy farms, about 20 to 40% of the cows will develop a clinical case of mastitis each lactation. This disease is so common on our dairy farms that sometimes we forget how expensive it is and how important it is relative to producing high quality milk that the market wants. Mastitis is also the most costly disease of dairy cow. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but mastitis has both direct and indirect economic consequences. And it's a unique disease because it both reduces milk yield, but it also reduces the value of the milk produced. It causes us to actually throw away our product, and then we have our costs of our treatments, and we have a lot of inputs on the farm that we do to prevent mastitis. Things like T-dips, things like having dry and sufficient bedding, things like having a good udder prep. Those are all things that we're investing in. I'll come back to those investments later to reduce the costs of this very common disease. So direct costs are usually pretty obvious, but there's also some very prominent indirect costs that happen as a result of that inflammatory response, which is actually systemic in the cow. We have reduced reproductive performance. We have reduced final product quality if we're selling high somatic cell count milk. And if we have milk that the market doesn't want, actually a reduced ability to sell our milk. And so there's a lot of costs that accumulate because of mastitis. It's a disease we can never forget about. So when we think about the importance of mastitis on our dairy farms, we have to think about the ways that we can manage it. And today I'm going to talk about 3 things that I think we all need to think about in order to be competitive with our milk in the future, to maintain the sustainability of our farms, to maintain the economic competitiveness, and to maintain the ability to sell milk. I'm going to start off by talking about what I call producing market-ready milk. In other words, producing milk that the market wants to buy. Now, what I did in this instance is I called a couple of friends who wanted to remain anonymous, who work for major milk processors. And if I mention either of these milk processors or co-ops, I'm not even going to say which they are, most of you would be able to identify it. And I had conversations with my colleagues about what kind of milk they really want to purchase. And I think one of the most important things to recognize is that people purchasing our milk want to purchase low-risk milk. They want to purchase milk that they don't have to worry about. So, when you look at specifically what people want, one person that I talked to said, doesn't matter what the regulatory requirements for milk are. They want to purchase milk that has a bulk tank somatic cell count pretty much every day of less than 150,000 cells. They want to purchase milk that every day has a low bacterial count. They want to purchase milk that has very, very low parts per billion chemicals, and they want to purchase it from a farm that is compliant with the programs by National Milk Producers Federation, the farm program, because they don't want any risks associated with all of those things that are audited within that farm program. The other person I talked to had similar requirements, only they were even a little more specific. This person wanted a somatic cell count average of less than 125,000. They wanted a standard plate count, or the bacterial count, less than 5,000 for 95% of the bulk tanks they pick up. They want low spore counts. They want low temperature on the recorder, less than 40 degrees. They want participation in good compliance with the farm program. And this farm volunteered that they wanted a farm that looked tidy and clean, and a farm where they could verify that the people working on the farm were well treated. So this is what we call market-ready, low-risk milk. And this is what we should be striving for in order to be competitive. Now, I want to show you a little bit of data on some factors that influence the microbial quality, especially of milk. Now, this data is a little bit old, but it wouldn't change at all. It's just data that I have that we published in 2009, where we had a really amazing data set. So let me orient you to this slide. This data was picked up from farms that shipped tanker loads. And we got the data on their bulk tank milk quality on 1,200 tanker loads in 1 year. So that's just under 3 tankers a day this particular farm was sending. This is a farm that has sand bedding. They had 1,200 tanker loads of milk leave their farm. And on the vertical axis on your left, that's the bulk tank somatic cell count or the standard plate count or the lab pasteurized count. I'll tell you which as we go along. And on your left is the coliform count. So all of these things were measured on this farm on each tanker. This is the somatic cell count of this farm. And you'll see here, this is 100,000. You'll see that most days this farm was just kind of fluctuating around 100,000. They had a few spikes now and then. Even on a farm of this size, you'll see a few spikes. But overall, great performance with cell count. This is the bacterial count, standard plate count of this farm, which also goes on this axis. You'll see most of the time it barely registers. Occasional spike, everybody knows that happens occasionally, but barely registers. This is the lab pasteurized count. This measures spores, typically affected by either biofilms that build up in the pipeline, or it could be affected by not doing an effective job of pre-milking hygiene, teat dipping and such, pre-milking hygiene. And you'll see most of the time it's very, very low on this farm. It looks good. And then finally, this is the coliform count. You know, our goal is to be pretty low on that too, and you'll see almost all the time. This is high microbial quality milk. Virgin sand bedded farm, excellent pre-milking prep. This is what we should be striving to produce and sell. This is a neighbor of that farm, same time period, same data. This farm used digester solids for bedding. And what I want to show you is it's simply harder in many instances to produce as high microbial quality milk when you have more exposure to bacteria. This is the somatic cell count of this farm. Remember the other one was down here at 100. This one's about 200. Not bad, a few spikes, but mostly between 200 and 250. This, however, is the lab pasteurized count. You can see lots of counts where it's a little higher, and that's simply because there's more bacteria on the teats. It's harder to clean them. This is the bacterial count. Remember the other one you could barely register down here. We've got days where we barely register, but we also have some pretty high spikes. And then this is the coliform count. You know, those digester solids are the best possible growth media for coliform bacteria, and they do grow there. It's harder to produce that low risk, high microbial quality milk when you've got more exposure to bacteria. And that's an important thing to think about as we think about management systems. So when we're talking about our goals for market ready milk, here's what we should all be striving for. Consistent low somatic cell count. We should be trying to produce milk that has consistently got a bulk tank somatic cell count less than 150,000 cells per ml. We want to have consistent low bacterial counts. Your total bacterial count or standard plate count should be less than 5,000. Lab pasteurized count, measuring those spores or those thermoduric bacteria, should be less than 100. Coliform count should be consistently less than 50. And in places where the PI count, preliminary incubated count, is done, this is usually done for fluid milk, should be less than 10,000. So this is what our goal should be, and we should be monitoring these levels. And then we should also be looking at having low risk farm practices. So a farm where we're producing milk that the market wants to buy. Now, what's competitive udder health? That's changed a lot in my career. This is data from AgSource. It has several thousand herds in it. This is the January 2021 data. It had almost 2,000 herds in it. I just want to point out this is looking at monthly DHI somatic cell count data. And let's start by looking at the percent of cows that have what we call subclinical mastitis. In other words, percent of cows that are over 200,000 at our most recent test. And what you'll see is it ranges from about 14 to 21%. When I started in this industry, it was normal to be above 30%. And now, if you want to be competitive, our average herds down here are producing about 85% of the cows are free of subclinical mastitis. The best 20% of the herds, not very much variation here, only about 10 or 11% of the cows have subclinical mastitis. Tremendous improvements in this. So this is a competition. These are the herds who've invested in producing milk and minimizing mastitis, and we've done a really, really good job on achieving competitive udder health. Now, that was DHIA somatic cell count data, and increasingly I hear about farms are like, well, I've got all these different kinds of sensors and stuff. I'm just going to use my bulk tank somatic cell count data, and I'm not going to invest in individual cow somatic cell count data. That is a very short-sighted decision, in my opinion. The bulk tank somatic cell count, especially on larger farms, is not enough data to manage udder health in individual cows. You need individual cow somatic cell count data in order to be able to detect subclinical mastitis and measure and manage it. I want to show you some data here. This is the bulk tank somatic cell count, okay, of 40-some herds by the clinical mastitis rate on those same herds. And what you'll see is that there's very, very little relationship. As the bulk tank somatic cell count goes up, only 3% of the variation in clinical mastitis rate is related to that bulk tank cell count. So for example, here's a farm that has a bulk tank cell count of 140,000, but they had 60% of their cows having a case of clinical mastitis. Here's a cow that, here's a herd that's got a bulk tank somatic cell count about 180, and they've got a clinical mastitis rate of about 12%. There's really almost no relationship. There is a relationship between the bulk tank cell count and the prevalence, or the percent of the cows in the herd that have subclinical mastitis. About 60% of the variation in prevalence of subclinical mastitis in a herd is explained by the bulk tank cell count. And that's because the driver for bulk tank cell count is the percent of the herd that's above 200,000. That's why I've got a straight line here. As the percent of cows with higher cell counts go up, the bulk tank cell count will go up. So take-home message here is you want to measure individual cow cell count because it gives you data that allows you to manage a lot of other characteristics of affecting animals on this herd. So what do we know about our first take-home point? First take-home point is use individual cow somatic cell count data to measure and manage animal health. We need it. It's a good investment. I've got lots more I could talk about on that, but this talk has some other topics I got to handle, but it's a good investment. All right, second thing I want to talk about producing low-risk milk is talking about antibiotic usage on our farms. This topic just blows me away sometimes because I know the progress we've made in managing antibiotics and reducing residues and just the small amount of antibiotics that are used on most farms. But our consumers don't perceive that. This survey really caught my eye. It's called Public Perceptions of Antibiotic Use on Dairy Farms in the U.S. This was a survey of 1,000 consumers conducted by the Cornell Survey Lab. And some of our colleagues at Cornell, Paula Moroney, Frank Welcome, and others, just got 4 questions added to the survey that's done every year by the Cornell Survey Lab. And one of the questions they ask is, they ask the consumers to rate the threat to their own health based on antibiotic usage in cows. And what I want to point out is 70% of consumers perceived moderate to high threat to their own personal health based on antibiotic usage in dairy cows. You know, that just shows the disconnect we've got, because those of us who work in the industry know that that's a perception, it's not reality. But it's really, really important for us to understand. I took this picture at the grocery store, my local grocery store, where on my card it said they're selling their brand Simple Truth, and it says proud of what's not in our food. So, that consumer trust in what we're producing is really important. And right now, we haven't done a good enough job really producing trust about our ability to manage antibiotic usage. So low-risk milk is produced from farms that use antibiotics only when necessary to maintain animal health and for the welfare and economic sustainability of the farms. Now, that's, I think, probably a given on most farms, because when people do surveying about why antibiotics are used on dairy farms, when we go and we ask farmers about it, antibiotic usage is normally motivated by the desire to maintain good welfare and to provide good animal care. But when we look at dairy farm usage, and this is a paper we published a couple of years ago where we quantified antimicrobial usage on 40 large Wisconsin dairy farms, what you'll see is tremendous variability. Here's farms that used very few doses. So they used about 2 doses per cow and free wean calf per year. And within that 40 herd data set, the highest using farms used about 15 doses per cow and free wean calf per year. So one of the things we learned from this study is there's tremendous variability among farms in the amount of antibiotics used. Again, good motivation for using these, but one of the things I'd say that most farmers don't know, and most of us don't know on our farms, is are we a high user or a low user? And how does a farm compare? Because those statistics aren't easy to get. And one of the things we produce, and one of the things we've been working on the last couple of years, is benchmarking. We produced a antibiotic usage benchmarking tool that uses data from both Dairy Comp and PC Dart at this time. We're working to add more, where we can help people figure out if they're high or low users. By the way, this is completely confidential data. You only have access to your own data. But we've been producing these reports on farms where we've got, we summarize antibiotic usage. It says your farm uses 5.4 doses per cow per year, which is right in the middle of our 40 herd data set. And that's actually about the average, about 5.4. Sometimes we go to farms and they're using 10.2. And on this particular farm, you'll see that most of that is systemic treatments, or which means there's probably some modifications that can be made. So what we'd like to do is not say to farms, you're using the wrong amount of antibiotics, but helping farms develop goals for antibiotic usage. And then having conversations with the local veterinarian about if those goals are appropriate for the farm, and having goals for moving forward in the future. So here's my second take-home point. We should all have goals for optimizing antibiotic usage on the farm, and those goals should be based on maintaining the welfare of the cows, maintaining the health of the cows, but also look at making sure that the conversations with the veterinarian are going on to stress prevention in reducing antibiotic usage to that's necessary to maintain the health on your individual farm. All right, so that's the market-ready milk. Let's move on to the second point that we can focus on gaining a competitive edge. And that's a point I think everyone will appreciate. And that's, we need to be simplifying the management on our farms. We really want to do things as simply as possible. And I've got a few suggestions for how you can simplify management on your farm. First thing I'd say is cull your chronic cows. You know, I go to a lot of farms, they're very overcrowded, 120, 130, 140% stocking density. And all I can think on these farms is there's some cows in these groups that everyone would be better off if they leave the herd. And keeping the chronic cows around increases the bulk tank cell count. Keeping those chronic cows around results in more infections in other cows. Keeping the chronic cows results in more clinical cases. Keeping those chronic cows results in more antibiotic treatments. Keeping those chronic cows requires more dry cow antibiotics, and guess what? Makes your life harder because you're going to have a lower conception rate. So one of the things you can do to simplify your management, make your life simpler on our farms, is to cull those cows. You know, I took a look at this data set I was talking about earlier where I have these 40 farms, and I looked at another couple of relationships. On this x-axis, I've got the percentage of cows that are chronic, and that was defined as 2 months somatic cell count over 200,000 individual cow. And then I looked at the bulk tank cell count. Now, you remember before that I had a kind of small relationship on some of these values with bulk tank cell count. Not here. The percentage of the herd that have a cell count, a chronic cell count, 2 months or more above 200,000 explains more than 50% of the bulk tank cell count. So if you've got more than about 5 or 6% of chronic cows, in other words, cows with 2 months of high cell count, very likely it's going to impact your bulk tank cell count. Now, the chronic somatic cell count also results in more new infections. On this particular axis, what we're looking at here is the new infection rate. Those are the cows that were less than 200,000 this last month, more than 200,000 this month. And you'll see it's not a super strong relationship, but the more chronically infected cows you keep in your herd, the more new infections you'll have in the herd. It's a self-perpetuating cycle. So to solve that, we want to get rid of those chronic cows. The other thing I want to remind you on, you don't treat your way out of chronic cows. Here's a cow, 5th lactation, calved at 728,000. Never dropped below 338 her entire lactation, had 3 cases of clinical mastitis, had to have multiple antibiotic treatments. You're not making money on these cows. This is not a low risk herd. We want to think about getting rid of those. So who should you cull? Who am I calling a chronic cow? Here's what I'd recommend. Cull all cows diagnosed with Mycoplasma bovis, chronic Staph aureus, or Prototheca bovis infections. Now, when I say all cows, I'm referring to herds that don't have hundreds and hundreds of cows. That requires, that are infected like this. That requires a different management strategy. I'm talking about when reasonable numbers are infected. I would recommend culling cows that have multiple quarters affected by mastitis. You know, each quarter has to get independently infected. If you've got a cow that's got 2 or 3 or 4 quarters infected, she's telling you she's not choosing to be a dairy cow. She'd prefer to be a beef cow. Cows that have more than 2 clinical cases in one lactation are also making a choice to change career. Older cows, meaning a cow in 3rd plus lactation that has more than 3 somatic cell counts above 200,000, should be looked at hard to be culled. And cows that maintain high cell counts over 2 lactations. These cows have something like 5 or 6-fold higher risk of clinical cases. In all instances, you'll simplify your life, make your life easier if you can cull those cows. So my take-home point 3, cull those chronic cows. Next point about simplifying management is, I've got a whole topics on this. I'm going to just briefly touch on this. But we need to think about the way we treat clinical mastitis. Clinical mastitis should be treated selectively. In other words, we should know what we're treating because about 50% of the cows that present with non-severe clinical mastitis don't require antibiotic therapy to recover. That abnormal milk that we see lasts about 5 days. That's inflammation. And in about 25 or 30% of those cows, the infection, the bacterial infection, is already gone by the time we see the inflammation. Another thing we need to think about is how many days should these cows be treated? The labels for all but one of the intramammary products that are sold in the United States are labeled for treatment 1 to 3 days. Only one product is labeled flexibly, and that product has a label from 2 to 8 days. Most cases are treated 5 days because inflammation lasts about 5 days, but very few cases require that duration of treatment. And in my career, the costs of treatment have essentially doubled. This is a picture from a figure that in a paper that Juliana Leite de Campos put in her PhD and is now just available online. The paper is going to be published this month in Journal of Dairy Science, where we looked at the costs of treatment. These are direct costs, just milk discard and medication costs of about 20,000 cases of mastitis on multiple farms in Wisconsin. On this axis, we've got on the horizontal axis, days in milk when the case occurred, and the vertical axis is the cost of milk discard and medication. So cow in the first 30 days costs about $170 in direct cost of medication and cost of milk discard to treat that. By day 90 to 120, when the cows peaked, it's over $200. When we put together this graph, I realized that the cost of the exact same treatment protocol when I started in practice has essentially doubled, because 80% of the costs, the direct costs of treatment, are related to milk discard. In 1984, the cows we were treating for mastitis produced about 50 pounds of milk. 2021, they're producing about 100. So my take-home point on that is maybe treat 1 day less. All right, so not much time left, and I want to get to my next topic a bit, but I'd ask you to think about reviewing your treatment strategies for non-severe cases of clinical mastitis. If possible, it should be selective intramammary antibiotics for gram-positive, no antibiotics for culture-negative, et cetera, et cetera. And when you're using a non-selective therapy, in other words, you're treating something you don't know what it's caused, try to follow your minimum label direction. Or if you're not comfortable doing that, if you're treating for 5 days a day, try treating for 4. The milk won't go back to normal faster, but your bacteriological clearance won't be affected. If you'd like more information on this, I've got a whole YouTube channel with many videos that you can take a look at that'll help you make some decisions in that area. My fourth take-home point is treat mastitis selectively, treat mastitis shorter. All right, final point. Final point, probably the most effective point, is one dealing with prevention. And that is the third point to gain a competitive edge in milk quality is use your money for strategic investments rather than spending it and losing that on costs of mastitis. Now, to discuss this, we've got to separate costs from investment. A cost is defined as the loss or penalty incurred in gaining something. So on our dairy farms, here's some costs. Manure storage, not making any money on that. Complying with environmental regulations, costs of doing business, don't make any money. Treatment of sick cows is a cost. The money we spend to treat a sick cow is simply a loss. And the key strategy there is to minimize the amount we spend while maximizing the outcomes. Investments are money we spend for future benefits. And so money we put into prevention is an investment. And that's where our emphasis should be. So things like effective teat dipping, somatic cell count data every month, employee training, providing dry bedding, scraping alleys, dry coat treatment. Those things are investments. And so we should have a plan where we're putting more money into our investments than we are into our costs. And so when we look at mastitis control, things like teat dipping, towel usage, vaccination, those things are investment. Now let's think about what causes mastitis. When we think about mastitis, all mastitis is infectious. Most are contagious. We think about contagious mastitis, the reservoir is the infected udder of a cow. The exposure is when teats in a healthy udder become exposed to infected bacteria in milk that came from an infected udder. And the key investment here is effective post-milking teat dipping. When we think about environmental mastitis, we think about this picture. The reservoir is the environment, moisture, mud, manure. Exposure is from contact of the teats with bacteria that live in that moisture, mud, and manure. And our key investment here is dry lying space. So the two key investments we can do is effective pre and post milking teat dipping and effective investments in dry space. Number one way we can maximize our teat dipping is to send the animals to the parlor that have dry and clean udders. This is really important for us to recommend. There are no teat dips that were developed and tested under these circumstances. Teat dips were tested on udders that look like this. This is udder hygiene scoring from 1 to 4. And this is a study we did where we did bacterial count swabs on udders of different farms and looked at the number of bacteria on the teat skin relative to udder hygiene scores. Udder hygiene score 1, there are about 80,000 colony forming units per mil. If we went to 2, it doubled, about 180,000. If we go to 3, it doubles again, logarithmic here, 338, and it almost doubles here at udder hygiene score 4. We need to be focusing on sending cows to the parlor with udder hygiene scores 1 and 2. And then finally, on this dry lying space, this is an actual picture I took when I was out on a farm out west somewhere. And I don't know if they thought maybe I wouldn't notice that, like, this group, because they knew I was coming to farm, had dry bedding in this area, but this is not an ideal circumstance. Providing enough dry lying space is a really important investment. All right, and what we need for that is a minimum of 100 square feet per cow if they're in group housing and less than 15% overstocked in pre-stalls on our high-risk groups. Here's something everybody can do as I wrap up. If you want to figure out if your calving areas have enough dry space, I'd recommend you do this process. Okay, everybody knows about this knee test, right? For cow comfort. You can go to your stall, fall to your knees, and see if you can get back up. If it's soft enough, you should be able to get back up. This is a similar test, only I recommend you do this all by yourself. You go to your calving area, take off all your clothes, lay down and roll around in it. If you're not comfortable doing that, it's not clean enough. That's what we should be striving for. So our 16th point is providing sufficient dry lying space. All right, I'm going to wrap up here so we have time for a few questions. Dairy farming is competitive. Our market has changed. If we want to be in that market, we have to produce market-ready milk. Market-ready milk has low cell count, high microbial quality, and it's low risk, minimal and justifiable antibiotic usage. Secondly, we want to simplify management. We want to do things easy. We want to cull those chronic cows, and we want to treat cows that get mastitis selectively and short duration. And then finally, when we think about one of the most important things is we don't want to lose money. We don't want to spend all money. We want to invest our money. And to do that, we need to make sure we've got effective post-milking teat dipping to limit the amount of contagious mastitis and provide sufficient dry lying areas. Those are both fantastic investments. Like more, stop at my Top Milk website. And with that, I'll hold up so we have time for a few questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Ruegg, for that presentation. I think we are all in the milk making business, so farms of any size and located anywhere, and we have listeners all across the world here. So the information you shared today is very valuable for people no matter where they are working with cows. So thank you for that. I'd also like to thank Boehringer Ingelheim for their sponsorship of this webinar. If you'd like to learn more about their company and products, please check them out online. If you'd like to view this webinar again, it will be available on our archive later this week. You can find this webinar and all of our past presentations at hordes.com on the webinar tab. So if you'd like to share this with somebody else or check it out for yourself, please visit our website to do that. I'd also invite you to make plans to attend our next 2 webinars. And those are coming up. Our webinars always take place on the second Monday of the month. If you can click ahead one slide, Pam. In October, we'll have a presentation by Dr. Bob James, who was a professor at Virginia Tech and now is a dairy consultant. He'll be talking about feeding calves today and tomorrow and some of the calf care that goes along with that. And then in November, we'll have a Feed and Forage Outlook presented by our friend Mike Hutchins from the University of Illinois, and then our very own Mike Rankin, the managing editor of Hay and Forage Grower magazine. So if you are interested in either or both of those topics, we hope that you'll join us for those webinars. Now we will go on to our question and answer section of the program. We did have some questions that came in, Pam, so I will just start firing those off now and give you a few moments to respond. You talked some about bacterial load in milk when you're doing bulk take samples. How does that change once milk is picked up from the farm and then it's transported to the processing plant? Any comments there on how maybe bacterial load changes during transportation?
So, that's a great question. That also has changed a lot. And I think that's why some of the expectations have changed. When I started in practice, milk was picked up maybe on many farms every 3 days. And it was held in relatively small bulk tanks. And my husband's farm in New Holstein, Wisconsin was just like this. I think they were picked up every second day, relatively small bulk tank. And, bacteria grow in milk. Milk is full of nutrients. It is a great growth media for bacteria. Now, because so many farms, if you have a larger farm and you're shipping multiple tankers per day, that milk is chilled before it goes into the tanker. It goes to the farm. It is extremely fresh. You'll have very minimal growth. If you've got milk that is held or heat gets out of that temperature range we have, it's going to grow. And all those types of bacteria will grow. That PI count will especially go up. But in most instances, most farms, most of the time, it won't have a huge impact.
Next question, what is your take on teat scrubbers as part of milking prep? Do you feel that they are worth the investment?
So, we actually published a paper. We did a project on 11 farms where we went to farms and we took the first 2 cows in the parlors and we did manual prep ourselves. So I brought the same people to the farm. We had 2 cows, or not 2 cows, we had 2 units. And we would do a manual prep on those cows. And before we do the prep, we check the number of bacteria on the teat skin. And then after the prep, we check how many bacteria were left. So we did that for the manually prepped cows. And then we also, these were all farms that had teat scrubbers. We did the same thing for the cows that were being prepped by the farm staff using the teat scrubbers. And that paper is published in Journal of Dairy Science. And we learned a couple things. One thing we learned was there was huge variability among farms. So some farms were amazingly successful with those teat scrubbers, and other farms weren't. And the number one thing that impacted that was the concentration of chlorine dioxide. All of these farms are using chlorine dioxide in the teat scrubbers. It varied. We titrated it on all the farms. It varied from, I think, I don't know, 50 parts per million to 800 parts per million. It was a real determinant of the ability to use it. So, you know, in asking, is it a good investment? I think it's like most other tools we have access to on dairy farms. If used properly, if good QC, quality control steps are put in place, it can work fine. But anytime you bring in technology with anything and you kind of take away a little bit of the oversight of the people, you can also make mistakes and do worse. So yeah, can work well, but you've got to follow the instructions. You've got to use sufficient chemicals, and you got to send clean udders to the parlor. That's a huge determinant on any pre-milking sanitation.
Another question that kind of follows along those lines, someone's wondering, do you feel if that breeding for low somatic cell count and genomic testing for other health, do you believe that's a good investment for herds to be striving or working with?
Yeah, it is. You know, if you look at the data on that, it's definitely helped. But it's a longer, slower process. And it's just one part of the puzzle overall, right? It's just like if you look at any individual farm, almost any individual farm, regardless of their breeding program, if you go to the farm, you're going to have a lot less mastitis in the younger animals. And that's subclinical and clinical mastitis. And that's because of the number one defense against mastitis is the teat sphincter. So, you know, in heifers, first calf heifers, you've got smaller udders, which means they have less exposure. You've got tighter teats. As cows milk, their teats get longer, their teat ends get wider. Both of those things reflect less ability to resist exposure. So if you've got the equivalent exposure, be it high or low on a farm, you'd expect to have less mastitis in younger animals than older. Same thing would happen with genomic selection. It adds a defense, but it won't overcome deficiencies in management.
Thank you for that insight. Next question. Is multispectral imaging an effective way to detect clinical mastitis, and how does that compare to force stripping in the milking prep routine?
I don't know. I'll tell you about the force stripping. One of the things on a good farm with good, well-trained, interested milkers, the milking technicians, those milking technicians are basically expert systems. Okay, so they're force stripping the cows, they're paying attention to it, and they're making judgments about what they see in that foremilk as to whether or not you need an intervention. So it's not like mastitis is always obvious. And what you'll have is maybe the cow doesn't let her milk down as much. They feel that the quarter's a little bit tight. They recognize a cow and think her milk may be a little watery or something. They put all of those things together and they'll decide whether to pull her to look in more detail. Same thing applies with any biosensor or imaging system we have. You can get a lot of data out of them, but the decision-making process based on that data is the hard part. And so when we look at almost any technology to detect mastitis, our problem isn't can the technology detect abnormal milk or swollen quarter or high cell count? It's what do we do with that data? Because with any detection system for any disease, the value of that technology is not whether or not it can detect the disease. The value is the value of the intervention. So the best detection systems are linked to valuable interventions. And I have no idea if virtually any of the detection systems we have out there today are cost effective in that way. It still requires humans.
When dealing with clinical mastitis, particularly something like strep uberis or E. coli, do you feel there are benefits from using injectable antibiotics as well as or instead of an intramammary tube?
Yeah, thank you for that question. In the United States, there are 0 injectable antibiotics that are approved to treat mastitis. 0. So that means any injectable treatment given for treatment of mastitis must be given under extra label usage guidelines. So it needs to be prescribed as extra label usage by a veterinarian. So that's just an important thing to recognize. Secondly, there is 0 data in the US that any of the drugs that we have access to treat lactating cows has any ability to penetrate the udder in sufficient concentration to affect clinical mastitis. So the answer is no. When I'd say that systemic injectable antibiotics are occasionally indicated is if you've got a really sick cow with mastitis, and in that instance, we're not treating the udder, we're treating really the risk of septicemia or bacteria in the bloodstream that sometimes happens in cows that are really sick with clinical mastitis. But in general, injectable antibiotics add a lot of cost with very little benefit, and they are an extra label treatment.
Thank you for making that point. This person is wondering how important pre-dipping is in the whole avoiding mastitis picture.
So, pre-dipping and post-dipping are highly proven to be effective in lowering the amount of bacteria on teat skin. And, pre-dip, I'm old enough that I remember when pre-dipping was invented. When I was in animal sciences before I went to vet school and milking cows at the university herd, pre-dipping hadn't been invented yet. We were still washing udders with iodine-based towels and things like that, as well as when I first went into practice. Pre-dipping was invented in the 80s. And there were several studies done in the 80s that showed that pre-dipping reduces the new infection rate about 5 to 6 fold. And that data has been reproduced at least within the last 10 years in studies done in New Zealand. So pre-dipping is a great investment. It should be well done, and it's one of our most effective prevention strategies against environmental mastitis.
Excellent. This person is asking, is there a somatic cell, like a rapid somatic cell test like there is for checking for antibiotics? Is that something that exists?
Yep, bunch of somatic cell count tests available out there. The cheapest one, of course, has been around since about 1955, and that's the California mastitis test. But there's a number of other somatic cell count tests, direct cell counter from DeLaval, various other technologies like that. Fair number of them out there. If you Google it, you can probably find a few.
Very good. Next question. Is there a minimum somatic cell count requirement that cows have so they have enough white blood cells to fight infection, or how low can we go?
So I have a whole talk on that. I wish we had more time, but here's the thing to think about. In cattle, in people, in any mammal, your white blood cells are produced in your bone marrow and they circulate in your bloodstream. So they're going through your blood vessels and they're flowing throughout our entire bodies. So in the cow, you've got these white blood cells, they're produced, they're circulating in the bloodstream, and they're flowing through the udder. And as they flow through the udder, they're bouncing off the walls of the blood vessels. So they're hitting the top wall, then hitting the bottom wall, then hitting the top wall and the bottom wall. And they're just going along, bouncing off these walls. And by the way, that's happening in all of us right now as well. And why they're bouncing off the walls is they're looking for a signal from that organ that they're needed there to go in and fight infection. So if there's no infection in the udder, those white blood cells just keep going, okay? And let's say they're circulating around in a cow that's got pneumonia. They got pneumonia, they'll go to the lungs to fight pneumonia. They'll have an influx of them. Let's say you go to a cow that's got a foot infection. If you've got a cow that's got an foot infection, while they're circulating around, they'll go to the foot. If you've got metritis, a uterine infection, they'll go to the uterus. If they don't go to the udder, it's because they're not needed there. and there's not very many of them. In a healthy uninfected mammary gland, you're going to have, I don't know, 50,000, 20, 30,000 cells there. Those are mostly like sentinels. They're hanging out looking for infection. So on all practical basis, no, not really too low. I mean, if you're less than 20,000 cells, maybe, but that'd be a pretty rare circumstance. I think on a practical basis, no. You're not looking for a bunch of cells there. You're looking for those cells to be responsive and able to go where they're needed. That happens in healthy cows.
Great. If anyone is looking for a copy of the handouts, you can find that in the handouts section of the control panel. There's a little tab arrow you can click down, and then there's a PDF link you can click to find those. Now, our last question, and I realize this one probably also could be its own presentation, but wondering about Prototheca mastitis. You know, why is it, maybe briefly, why is it different? What can we do to control or treat it?
Yeah, Prototheca is a super annoying organism. For one thing, it's an algae. It's not a bacteria, it's an algae. And I think that's an important and critical thing to think about and to understand with this organism is because it's an algae, think about where algae will grow. Algae require water. When we get into problems with Prototheca mastitis, we want to be looking at hygiene and water sources on the farm and looking at reducing those. Prototheca is annoying because it's the particular species of it that's causing mastitis is host adapted to dairy cattle. It's now called Prototheca bovis, and it can spread in a contagious manner amongst cattle, and we don't have any tools to deal with it. So, you know, typically the strategy to deal with Prototheca today is to identify infected cows and cull them, you know, assuming that you don't have too many of them. But you also have to look at prevention, just like any other disease. And to do that, we've got to look at drier bedding materials and hygiene during intramammary infusions like dry cow treatment or teat sealant. Those are also have been shown in a Canadian study to be risk-factor. So pretty annoying organism, not a lot of tools to deal with. We've got to work on prevention.
As we wrap things up here, I'd like to thank Dr. Pam Ruegg from Michigan State University for answering those questions with her thoughtful insight, and then also for a great information shared on producing high quality milk during the presentation. I'd like to extend a thank you to my teammate Patty Hurchin for her help on the production side of the webinar. And then last but not least, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Really hope that you found this information to be useful for you on your dairy or the dairy farms that you work with. So we hope that you'll join us again for a future webinar. Once again, they always take place the second Monday of the month at noon Central Time. And we'll look forward to seeing you again. So until next time, goodbye from our team here at Hoard's Dairymen.